All right, so it's now the top of the hour, so gonna give everyone a few more minutes to get into the room and get settled. We'll get started in just a minute or two while we wait for a few people to trickle in. Just looking through the attendees. I recognize a lot of your names from sending us samples in, so welcome. Try to do one of these webinars about once a month. We just got this one in at the end of the month here. We did a webinar earlier a few weeks ago with InterNACHI. If any of you guys were part of that, thanks for coming to that. So just another minute and we'll kick off with our webinar this month. Everything you wanted to know about mold, but were afraid to ask. Just so everyone knows, we do record all of these webinars and we host them on our website so you can revisit them. And if you don't quite remember what we talk about, maybe you want to go back and review a slide or two from an old webinar. A few days after, we usually email out a link to everyone to recording, and then we put it on our website as well. So you can access any of these topics, even if you weren't an original attendee. So we'll go ahead and get started. So everything you wanted to know about mold, but were afraid to ask. So we're covering a lot of things today. We have an agenda, but this webinar is really for you guys to ask the questions that you have about mold, whether it be mold in the built environment, just mold in general, any topic that you see and you have questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll answer questions as we go along, and then there'll be a good amount of time towards the end for question and answers as well. We've allotted more time than usual for questions, just because this topic, I can predict, because I've had this conversation hundreds of times. I can predict what some of the questions are and put it into our presentation, but it's not always all encompassing. So feel free to ask us any questions you have um, with anything that I'm talking about. So we'll start off with just some basics about mold in general. We'll start to discuss mold in the natural environment, so mold in nature, the soil, the trees, all over the place. Mold in the built environment, so being home inspectors, this is primarily what you're concerned with, the conditions and situations that can allow for mold to grow in the built environment, the types of mold to be worried and concerned with, and uh, things to look for. Uh, Probably the most requested webinar topic that we've had is the health effects related to mold. There's a lot of concerns out there, and a lot of good, bad, and just straight up wrong information out there on the internet. So we want to try to give you the facts as we understand them today, and just communicate some of the health hazards that may be involved with mold. And then there'll be a decent amount of time for questions at the end, as well as, like I said, throughout the presentation. So a little about me. My name is Dylan McIntosh. I'm a certified industrial hygienist, lab director, Sporesight product group manager here at TechSite. I'm also a PAACB certified spore analyst. So what that means is essentially I've done hundreds of mold and moisture and air quality evaluations of properties, residential, commercial, industrial, all sorts of different places. I've done assessments, and then I've also done laboratory work. I've done the analysis for mold sampling, as well as operated an in-house laboratory. And then now I'm here at TechSite running our Sporesight product. So a little bit about us. I know, like I said, some of your names look familiar, so you're already familiar with us, but there are some names on there that I didn't recognize. So our company is called TechSite, founded in 2013. We're leaders in machine learning, artificial intelligence, computer vision, digital microscopy, all of that to build these tests for air, liquid, smearable diagnostics. Were used in laboratories, pathologists, doctors, vets, home inspectors all across the world. There's three kind of pillars to our company. There's Sporesight, our environmental vertical of the company, which all of you are familiar with. That's handling our mold analysis now and in the future, additional tests as we build them out. Human analysis, that's our under the brand of TechSight, our company name. We do a number of human-based tests. We have a new collaboration that we announced as of about 2 weeks ago with Mayo Clinic, be the preferred partner for digital diagnostics going forward, which we're really excited about that. And then animal analysis under the veterinary space, we built the product and licensed it through Zoetis, which is one of the largest pet pharmaceuticals companies in the world. They're a publicly traded company as well. So each one of these pillars, verticals, we're all operating on the same technology and the same platform. So we're in a really unique spot where we're bringing this technology that's being used in all these other spaces to home inspectors in the environmental market. Because without the other verticals in our company, there'd be no way we could build just this all by ourselves. So it's a team effort. We like to say we have a commitment to inspectors. We're direct to the inspectors. We don't have any third party, taking our technology and then reselling it out to you guys. So we get a lot of direct interaction with you guys. We want to make your lives better, your jobs easier. We're always innovating and changing as we learn new things and as we come up with new ideas. We're continuously innovating on our product, our reports. Our goal is to become the number one lab for home inspectors. It's a big goal, but we've got the right pieces for that. And then service. If you are one of our existing clients, you probably know Jim Bates, our director of sales. You probably have his phone number in your phone, and you probably know if you call him up, he's going to respond. If he doesn't pick up the phone right then, he's going to call you back in a number of minutes. So we like to extend that to all aspects of our product. And then the big thing is we want to give you guys a report that's thorough, easy for home buyers to understand, and is high value with a relatively low cost. So we'll continue on just into the actual presentation for today. What is mold? It's the easiest, the basics, back to basics. So what mold is it's a filamentous fungi, what does that mean? So it grows via these growth structures called hyphae. If you think of those structures as the roots of a tree that kind of just grow outwards and branch off, mold grows in these long filaments. And they reproduce generally with spores. These spores are 2 to 100 microns in size, so they're microscopic in size. You can't see them with the naked eye, and that's where our tests come into play. They grow in colonies on surfaces and soil, on plants, all sorts of things. The big thing is the color of growth is not a reliable indicator of exposure risk. You've probably heard the term toxic black mold or black mold. Not all black molds are toxigenic. Not all black molds are any more concerning than any other color. So one thing that I want to just dispel in your head, if you think black mold is the worst mold, it's generally not true. It could be white, green, brown, red, pink, yellow, all colors of the rainbow, and all different textures. And you just don't know what that mold is unless you actually sample for it. Mold is saprotrophic. Well, that's kind of a interesting word, but what that means is they get nutrients by breaking down organic matter. They decay objects in nature. So without fungi, our forests would be 400 feet deep of old trees and leaves and other other fallen items. None of that would break down. None of that would decay without fungi. So they play a vital role in just the natural cycle. They don't produce their own food like plants, and they don't um, really eat necessarily other living things. They break down dead or decaying material, and they're present in nearly all natural environments. They can be found in the desert, in the Arctic, in the ocean, in your house, on your skin, inside of your body. They're all over. Fungi and molds are all over. So there's not really a way to be mold free or clear of mold. It's just understanding what's the normal levels and types, and then what's different. Um, looks like we have a question from Randy. I'm going to get to your question in a little bit. We have a little spot in our report about our reports and the levels that we report on. So I'll get to that a little later, but I want to acknowledge your question now, so you're not waiting for it to be answered. Mold versus mildew. Mildew is a misnomer in a lot of instances. A lot of people like to use the term interchangeably, or maybe they use mildew as a way to describe light growth on tile or on non-porous materials that can be easily cleaned off. A true mildew, the actual organism that is a mildew, is a plant pathogen, meaning it's a disease to plant. It grows on living plants and harms it in its growth cycle. True mildews don't grow on building materials. Most of the time, what you might be calling mildew is actually mold. We've got an image here. So on the left, we've got mold growth. On the right, we've got mildew growth. Unless you've got a plant in your home with some dusty looking growth on it, you probably don't have mildew in your home. It's actually mold. In our reports, we do report on a few types of mildew. Oidium is a big one. Peronospora is another one. So we do find and classify these things because they are present in nature and in the outdoor air from time to time. But generally speaking, you wouldn't expect that to be growing on your drywall in your home. So we'll kind of start with mold in the natural environment. So truly speaking, all molds are molds from the natural environment. There's not really any specific genus or species of mold that I'm aware of that is truly cosmopolitan. It truly just lives in the built environment. All of the things that we see growing on building materials have a natural place in the soil or on plants or in other places in nature. So like I said, it grows in soil, living plants, dead plants, any place in nature that has the required nutrients, temperature, moisture, some other more niche requirements that some specific fungi might have. They might need really unique moisture requirements, or they will only grow on in certain conditions in certain places. Like I said before, it's present all over the earth in all biomes, even underwater. And mold spores naturally are dispersed by a number of different mechanisms. So they can be blown in the wind. There's some mold spores that grow on growth structures that look almost identical to dandelion heads. And as anything disturbs or brushes or blows across the surface, those spores get released in the air. Other spores may be sticky or heavier, where they get dispersed by bugs and wildlife, where they might stick to a beetle and get carried down the forest path and settle into another situation. And all sorts of different mechanisms of disbursement. Some common outdoor molds that we see in our reports pretty commonly: Curvularia. Ascospores is the large group of spores. They don't all look like that one in the picture. There's tons of different ones. We just summarize them all as ascospores, except for the specific ascospores that we're concerned with that we'll call out by name, like Chaetomium. Basidiospores, another large group of mold. These come from mushrooms and puffballs outside. This is a great picture because you can see all those blue objects, and even that darker brownish black one. Those are all different types of Basidiospores there. They vary pretty drastically in size and color, shape. but generally speaking, you don't have basidiospores indoors unless you have a very large problem and you're seeing the fruiting bodies of mushrooms or puffballs or other things. Cladosporium, now this is one you can see growing indoors. It's really probably the most common mold in the world. Outdoors, it is one that can grow indoors on occasion, but it is a very common outdoor mold. Epicocum, that's another one that typically grows outside that you would not expect to see growing inside under very rare occasions. And there's many more. If you've seen our report, we have a whole page, probably almost 30 different classes of outdoor molds. These are just some of the more common ones and more photogenic ones that look good on the pictures. We'll jump in now to probably the meat of our presentation today. Mold in the built environment. So this is talking about mold growing on building materials and indoors, where you home inspectors will be looking and identifying and coming up with the reasons why and how to address to guide your clients. So the build, as I saw in a couple slides back, there's three primary requirements for mold to grow. And the built environment have two of those three almost all the time. The proper nutrients can be found on wood, dust, fabrics, papers, all sorts of materials can be proper nutrient source for mold growth. And then the temperature that many molds like to grow at are found in the conditioned space indoors. Generally, it's not super acidic or basic pH. It's pretty neutral, and it's generally a pretty habitable place. That's why we like to keep our homes the way we do. It just so happens that mold also can like the same things. The one limiting factor is the availability of moisture. So the absence of moisture is really what keeps mold from just growing all over the place. And other things like general housekeeping and cleaning go a long way as well, because you can clean up free nutrient sources or small microscopic colonies before they grow larger. But for generally speaking, moisture is the key mitigating factor. So what does that mean if you find mold? It's truly a signal that there's a moisture problem present or at some time. And while remediation of mold should be done, really the core thing you need to address is to also address whatever that moisture source is that allowed for that mold growth in the first place. Because if you remediate mold and you don't address the moisture problem, you will have a mold problem again at some point in the future. If that roof leak or plumbing leak or unchecked humidity indoors doesn't get addressed, you put brand new building materials back in after remediation, you'll have mold growth again down the line. So some pictures of various places you can find mold growth. You've got condensation on this window with some dust. There's some dark colonies in there. Most likely this is going to be mold. On the right, you've got what looks like is a roof leak, or maybe there's maybe that beam is AC duct, and maybe there's condensation on there or above. It's hard to tell, but there's some sort of moisture leak. You see water staining, and then I see what looks like could be some mold colonies in those darker spots. These are great places. If you see things like this in your inspections, this is a great place to take a surface sample from, because then you can get that analyzed by the laboratory, and then you can get a report to say if this discoloration is mold or not. The one on the left, not so much all that crucial, because you can easily clean that up. It's a pretty small area. But the one on the right with the water leak, knowing if there's surface mold growth there is an important factor in how you would address resolving this issue. So those are things to be aware of that you should be thinking about in your inspections. Here's another one. This is a picture of some pretty serious mold growth. Something like this, you probably don't even need a sample because it's so apparent and widespread. You can even see what looks like some colonies growing on that ceiling fan. This is a photo from a property after a hurricane. So lots of moisture came in, the property was closed up for a significant amount of time, and you come back and there's pervasive mold growth throughout. I got a question here from Kendrick. Will mold that had the right conditions to grow during the construction period continue to grow after the home is completed and the moisture and temperature are no longer preferred conditions for mold growth? So, a really great question. In the construction process, you've got lumber that's been sitting in a lumber yard. Maybe it's been sitting on the job site for a month and just getting rained on and snowed on and all sorts of things. I know the lumber's damp. Um, it gets put up, framed up, and maybe as you're framing the house, the roof doesn't get put on in time, and some moisture comes in, and then the home gets finished. If there was mold that was available to grow on those building materials during the construction process, will it continue to grow? And the answer is generally no. Once you remove the conditions that are allowing for that mold to grow, in this case, the moisture, right? We close the home off. The moisture is now controlled. If there was mold that had grown on that lumber, either on the job site or in the lumber yard or before it was finished completely, that mold will not continue to grow after the moisture has been removed from the environment. It'll just kind of basically just stop growth when the moisture dries up. Those spores and other things that are produced aren't going to keep growing. Now, if it gets wet again, those hyphae could continue to grow. The spores could then find another habitable spot and continue to spread. But when the moisture is removed, it won't continue to grow unchecked. Justin, I'd like to appreciate some guidance on taking effective tape samples to submit, like the ceiling scenarios you're showing. That's a great question. So, surface sample, there's two main types: a tape lift or a swab sample. So I'll cut back to the last page here. An effective strategy, I'd get on a ladder, I'd get up and look closely and look to see areas of this staining that appear to be darker in color. Maybe the texture is different than the surrounding areas. Maybe the stain is darker in one spot than another. This picture, it's hard to tell. Are those dark spots nails, or are they potential colonies? When you've got a wide area like this, getting up close and personal is my best suggestion to find the right place to sample, because your tape is really maybe a square inch, and you might have 2 square feet, 4 square feet of water damage. So you've got to find a good place to sample if you're using a tape lift. Now, if you're using a swab, it's a different story, because you could swab over a lot of that area with a single swab, and you won't retain a lot of the tape lifts are preferred by the lab because you retain the structures as they're growing on the surface. So it's way easier for us to determine if it's hyphae and spores and growth and fruiting structures. Where you use a swab, you end up disassociating all of those particles. So when we analyze it, it can be unclear if it's potentially growth, or it could be things that are unrelated. But when you've got a large area to sample, it might not be a bad idea to use a swab if you don't want to take a few tape lifts. Tape lifts are simple. They're called tape lifts because many people will just use a transparent Scotch tape, press it on the surface, and then peel it off slowly. You don't want to collect any paint or any heavy debris. You want to keep it just the surface layer. It's hard to analyze it when there's a lot of debris or peeled paint underneath. Our lab, we use some prepared tape slides. They're flexible plastic slides with an adhesive section on them that you would just go up, press it on that surface, and peel it off. We have on our website, we have some field guides for collecting tape samples. We have a video that covers it as well. It discusses situations where you might prefer a tape sample versus a swab sample, and general surface sampling tips as well. So hope that answered your questions on tape samples. Like this one, like I said, this one's so clear, I wouldn't even bother with the tape sample unless you really wanted to be belts and suspenders. you're on the stand and you're getting interrogated. How do you know that's mold growth? Well, I took a sample. If you really want to make sure you're covering everything, you take a sample, but this is pretty clearly a mold situation that needs to be addressed. So here's some photos and names of indoor types of mold. So by indoor molds, what does that mean? In our report, we break it down into three categories. We've got the outdoor molds, which we discussed earlier. Those are types of mold that are found in the natural environment that don't grow on building materials commonly or readily. Um, that we want to start to associate what's from the natural environment to outside and what may be coming from the indoor environment from internal growth. So Chaetomium, Eulocladium, Aspergillus penicillium. Now this is one that Aspergillus penicillium, it can be found growing indoors, can be found in the outdoor environment as well in some significant amounts. It's also a group. We report on this one as a group because the spores, for the most part, can be hard to discern from other similar shape. They're generally small, round in shape, may have some attachment points. Scopulariopsis, which looks similar, but they're more shield-shaped or pear-shaped. They've got two attachment points on either end. And then Stachybotrys, which is when you hear the term toxic black mold, they're typically discussing Stachybotrys, but we'll go over the toxins from mold in a little bit, and we can talk about that. So you've got some questions here. Kendrick, what are the different types of mold and when does it become a health concern? I know you might be covering this later. Does it matter the location of the mold in the home? Example, is it dangerous if it's in the attic? So we'll have a whole section about health effects and the different types of health effects and the cliff notes that I'll leave you on until we get to that section is as home inspectors, you want to stay away from the term safe or healthy because we're not medical professionals and there's no official guidelines that we could say for a safe level of mold or safe types of mold. So we need to start thinking of it in the frame of we're assessing the built environment and the condition of the air quality and the built materials inside. We cannot really say if it's healthy or safe or not because we're not medical professionals. There are some, we'll talk about the health effects for mold and what to expect in the general terms. Generally speaking, the location matters in the sense that if you have a sensitive individual in the property, the places where they're most likely to be exposed are going to be more concerning than others. Places where they spend a lot of time, places where they may be eating and touching surfaces that may have mold are of concern. Bedrooms where people may be sleeping for 8 hours a night, you spend a lot of time in bed. And then another being some molds grow on certain materials better than others. So there's somewhere with water damage drywall versus water damage attic sheathing. Generally speaking, the water damage drywall is probably supporting more of the more notorious mold types than the attic sheathing generally may be supporting, but it's not always true. We have another question from David. If you have an old surface, like on a wall under a kitchen sink, do you need any type of treatment if there's no longer moisture? So that's, maybe I'll add to what I think you're asking. If you have mold growth underneath the kitchen sink or any other area, there's a kitchen leak 10 years ago and it just wasn't cleaned up very well, but it's not leaking right now. Do you need to do treatment if there's no longer moisture? And the answer is typically yes. You want to remove the moisture from the equation, but two, you do want to remediate or remove or clean those surfaces from that may be impacted from mold growth. And different surfaces and different materials call for different remediation methods. But generally speaking, even if that mold isn't actively growing, you want it removed from the environment as a standard practice. It's not always possible with every case, but generally speaking, you want to remove the mold, even if it's no longer a threat to continue to grow. So if you have elevated mold, if you find mold on the surface, what do you do? So the the gold standard industry reference is IICRC S520. There's other industry guidelines and other industry, different industry groups for mold remediation that have different resources, but this is what I would consider the gold standard. And if you talk to a mold remediation professional, or if you've been in the restoration industry, you're probably familiar with IICRC and their standards for all sorts of things. S520 is their mold remediation standard. And if you're wanting to get serious in the mold and moisture inspection game, you would be well served to get a copy of that and read through it to understand kind of the standard ways to address mold growth on in certain situations. They have different conditions of materials, and they tell you how to address growth on specific porous, non-porous, semi-porous, other things like that. But in a general sense, physical growth should be removed. If you have a porous surface, like drywall, it's typically best to demo and remove and replace. Now, it's best to do this under controlled conditions, so you're not releasing and spreading the mold into the air. That creates a secondary problem. But you could have a whole webinar on containment and remediation controls, which we won't really discuss here. But generally speaking, you want to remove porous materials that have been damaged, things like lumber, attic sheathing, 2x4s, solid wood products. Generally speaking, those are abraded, so wire brush, sandpaper, media blasting, dry ice blasting are different treatment methods for things like that, because you can imagine if you've got some old growth in your attic sheathing, it'd be way more expensive to rip off the roof and replace it than it would be to abrade the surface that was impacted by the mold growth and keep it in place. So non-porous surfaces, tiles, and even some semi-porous things can typically be cleaned and not removed and replaced. Fabrics can be typically laundered, as their care label indicates. Cleaning is, I'm sure someone is probably typing this question as we speak. What do you use to clean? Do you use bleach? Do you use hydrogen peroxide? Do you use vinegar? Do you use the mold killer from Home Depot? What do you use? Now, there's a number of different options commercially available. Chemicals, you want to make sure that you're just following the instructions and that they are registered with the EPA under the proper use that you're trying to use. But generally speaking, a solution of dish detergent and water does a significant amount of cleaning duty for this case for mold. So like a few pages back, we had the vinyl window sill that had the mold growth. If that was my home, I'd get a dish detergent and water and clean it up that way. I wouldn't necessarily use bleach or any more harsh chemical when that does the trick. Now, if there's mold growth or mold impacting your air quality, maybe there's a botched remediation in someone's basement and now there's thousands and thousands of spores in the air, but there's no mold remaining because they cut it all out. In these cases, you want to use a HEPA air scrubber to clean out the air. These are high efficiency particulate filtered air scrubbers that are moving a lot of air. They're very big. They're much more powerful than your typical air purifier that may have a HEPA filter. These things move a ton of volume of air to clean it very rapidly. And then also, if you have air quality issues, that also means that those spores will naturally settle out. And what that means is they'll eventually rest on surfaces and dust on fabrics, on sofas and things like that, and the carpets. And if you were to have a huge amount of spores in the air, they settle out. As you walk across that carpet, you're going to resuspend spores into the air that could cause air quality issues to continue after you've done air scrubbing. So typically, it's good to do a detailed cleaning, HEPA vacuuming of surfaces, cleaning of surfaces with like I said, dish soap and water in conjunction with air scrubbers. Jim, I see. Have you heard of the dry fog mold remediation system? There's a number of these products out there. So I should just have a caveat. I'm not a professional remediator. I've never been in the restoration industry. I've always been in the testing side. I do know IICRC S520 does not have any specific language about fogging as it being an effective method. And if you think of it in the steps that we've talked about of removing the mold from the environment, cleaning the air, and reducing the moisture, a dry fog doesn't do any of those things on face value. Now, there's some out there that say that they can destroy the structures of spores and fungal structures. I can't assess those claims one way or another. But generally speaking, I stand by IICRC S520, which does not endorse doing dry fogging as a primary way to remediate mold. But like I said, I'm not a professional remediator. There very well may be products out there that do the trick effectively. I don't know. So this is going back to one of the questions earlier. If you've seen our reports, you're familiar with our little graphs, our summary graphs. Now, this is our report. We have a limited interpretation, we say, where we look at the numbers, we compare them to outdoor reference samples that you take. Our system has some algorithmic logic that decides if it's going to trigger one of these three results. So we've got three different results: none, slight, and major. None, that's very easy. Our system has indicated that there is not evidence to support that there's been an elevated mold level in the air of these samples. Major is another one where it's pretty clear cut. There's some major elevations. These are things that we're finding are extremely abnormal, very high, very indicative of a mold problem. Now, where we get a lot of calls from you guys is the slight result. And if we had 3 results, if we had 10 results, that one in the middle is always going to be the trouble one, because it's hard because we can only do a limited interpretation because we're not on the site. We're not assessing the home in the ways that you guys are. And maybe you guys are just taking air samples and you're not doing a detailed mold inspection, and that's what many of you do. So what the slight result indicates is the results are out of spec for what we'd consider to be normal. Not saying that it's possible that these results could be not indicating a elevated level of mold, or it could be that there is evidence. When you see this result, this is an indication that one, if you did a moisture evaluation, if you use a thermal camera to check for moisture or use moisture meters, to look back at those and see if you found any active moisture in the property, or if there is visible discoloration that may be mold growth. Maybe you didn't do those things, and maybe this is a clue to say to your client that you'd recommend hiring an environmental professional to come out and do a really detailed mold inspection, a true purpose mold inspection where they go top to bottom with the expertise of an environmental consultant might have. It's where you need to start piecing these things together from other places to make your final judgment call. So it's the trickiest one. There's an infinite amount of ways that this could turn out in a slight case, and they can be kind of tricky sometimes. So it's one that, like I said, we have 3 results. If we had any more, it doesn't matter. The one right in the middle is always going to be that trouble one where it's like, is there a problem or is there not a problem? I've got a couple other questions here, Robert. Fogging using chlorine dioxide, your thoughts? I don't have thoughts one way or another. I just, like I said, I'm not in the remediation game, and I don't know all the products that are out there and their efficacy for fogging. Just kind of stick to the IACRC S520 doc, which uh, is does not endorse fogging as a primary method for remediation. Gene has another question. Moisture reading on a wall, and you open the wall, you find more mold on the inside of the interior of the wall. So I don't know. I think you're kind of asking like what's happening in this situation, and this kind of opens up the thought of when we're doing mold assessments, we can only assess what's available to us, right? We're not, as home inspectors, we're not knocking down walls, we're not cutting into walls generally. We don't have X-ray vision. Um, so there is times where you can find moisture on a wall. There's no visible mold growth there. Maybe you air sample in that room. There's no elevated levels of mold. The home buyer buys the home, say they're going to knock that wall out because they're going to open up the kitchen, make it nice and open. And when they're demoing the wall, there's a ton of mold, and there's been a something leaking there for years, and there's mold all over the place. And they come and say, "You didn't catch this mold in your test." Well, there's no pathway for that mold to get out of the wall. Mold can't just diffuse through walls. It gets through tiny, small, microscopic air gaps, electrical junction boxes, gaps from uh, trim and other things, but it can't go through the wall, generally speaking. So um, it's one of these things where we don't have a way to, the only way to determine if a house is completely mold free would be to dismantle it and check every piece. And we can't do that. So there are situations where uh, you have a hidden mold growth inside of a wall that's actively wet, or even maybe it's not actively wet. Maybe there was a leak in the past that we just don't know about that supported for some growth happening. And it's not impacting the air quality, and you don't know it until you look into the wall. Um, Jim has a very simple and very similar question. The customer smells mold, but there's no evidence. Would air sample pick up the mold? So the odor, that earthy, kind of dank smell that you associate with mold growth, that is typically what you'd call an MVOC, a microbial VOC. And what that is it's these chemicals that are off gas just through the natural metabolism and natural life cycle of whole sorts of microbials. Human, our body odor, right? If we didn't bathe or wear deodorant, our natural body odor is not actually natural. Our body odor, it's the microbiome of all the different bacterias and yeasts and fungi growing on your skin that's producing these chemicals that are making you give off that odor. So it's a similar process for the musty odor you smell in a home. That's an indication where you may recommend testing. It's not necessarily always going to pick it up, and that's because the odor is not the particulate of mold. You're not smelling the mold spores. You're smelling a gas that they are emitting um, from them. And it's not only mold that emits these things. It could be bacterial or other microbes. It could be something else altogether. But it is a clue where it might be evidence to suggest testing for mold, because there's a few things you can find out in this scenario. One, is the mold impacting the air quality? Are you getting exposed to mold in the space? Um, but in those events, I always like to say, if you're smelling it but not picking up on an air sample, it's not necessarily saying that there is not mold somewhere. It could be somewhere hidden or such small quantities that it's not detectable in these levels. Switching gears to surface, um, surface sampling is a little more straightforward than air sampling because either that surface has mold or it does not have mold. It's either present or absent. There is a little bit of nuance here because our reports, this is just a summary page. We do have different levels, high, low, moderate, heavy growth, or background amounts. So the big thing here is discerning what is potential growth and what is potentially just normal fungal ecology. Like I said, spores settle onto surfaces out of the natural air. If I were to take a tape lift or a swab of my desk here and put it under our scope, we'd probably find a handful of mold spores. It doesn't mean there's mold growing on my desk. It just means that there is some mold floating around in the air. Maybe it came in from outside and it settled and collected onto my desk. So that's the big thing we're trying to discern from surface samples is there growth, or is it just normal fungal ecology, or is it clear? And that's what our summary says here. So we'll get into the health effects here. With here, there's a pretty heavy disclaimer. I kind of touched on this before. Exposure to mold and air particulates can have a range of health effects, and these effects can vary drastically depending on the type of mold or particulate, as well as the individual sensitivity and the exposure level. If you or your client or anyone else is experiencing health issues that you believe might be related to mold or airborne particulate, it's important to speak with a qualified healthcare professional for proper diagnosis and treatment. Home inspectors, we assess the conditions of the building systems and materials. We're not performing safety, health, or risk evaluations in the home. And these are important things to remember when you're communicating to your clients. We're telling them, is the air quality in the home of a normal amount or potentially elevated or abnormal amount? Are surfaces clear of mold? Is discoloration, mold growth, or some other discoloration? Are those building materials impacted? Well, as home inspectors, you want to be really careful not to make assumptions or extrapolate air quality concern with a safety concern, because we don't have those guidelines and we don't have those references to make those calls on a reliable basis, and there's some liability that may be there if you step over that line. So this section generally just covers general information related to health effects mold can have in humans. It's not all encompassing, and this information shouldn't be used to diagnose, treat, or provide medical care in any way, just for your information and to give you some background information on how humans can react to mold. So, as I kind of mentioned, not everyone reacts to exposures the same way. Some people are just predisposed. Maybe it's genetic, maybe it's from other factors, health history, things like that. Uh, the Someone could spend a significant amount of time in a moldy environment and not have any detrimental effects, and other people could spend a short amount of time and start to experience complications. The important thing to note is there's no government or industry or otherwise guidelines for safe or acceptable levels of mold, which makes it tricky for interpretation because these levels can vary widely just from the natural environment. Florida, you could have 10,000 spores in your natural air, and that could be just a normal Tuesday. If you go up to the mountains in Idaho in the middle of winter, if you had 10,000 spores in your air, that would be extremely abnormal. So it's so varied, there's no reliable way to say what's safe or acceptable, even just speaking of naturally occurring molds. And then health effects can vary dramatically depending on exposure conditions, the types of mold, the amount, so the dose of your exposure, and the route of exposure. Typically, when we talk about route of exposure, we're talking about oral, so you're eating it or ingesting. Dermal, it touches your skin. Or respirable, you breathe it in. I'll stop right here. I got a question. Is remediation visible? For instance, could you see a difference before and after picture of an attic wood area with mold and then when it has been remediated? If it's been remediated correctly, yes, you would see a visual difference in the surfaces. If you're following IICRC S520, sounds like a broken record. If your attic sheeting has mold, the way to do that is to abrade the surface. So if there is dark mold growth, you'd be removing it using abrasion, sandpaper, wire brushes, media blasting, etc., and then cleaning up that debris. So you'd be exposing you'd be grinding it down to a fresh part of that that sheathing, so there'd be no more discoloration. Some remediators who don't follow IICRC S520 will do encapsulation, and they won't actually remove mold growth from the surface. They'll use a surface treatment that's similar to like a paint. It can be sprayed on, rolled on, etc. There may be multiple steps where first they put on a biocide to kill the mold, and then they encapsulate the mold with the surface materials, these surface coatings. Generally speaking, I'm not really qualified to say if that is or is not acceptable. I've seen and tested in homes that have been remediated in that way, and have tested the air and surfaces and not been able to find them. Some of those encapsulants are clear in color, so you could still see the visible discoloration under it, but it's a solid surface coating that's impermeable, ideally, and I've tested in situations where that's cleaned it up, but generally speaking, the removal of the mold is preferred to encapsulation. So now we're actually talking about the health effects, the individual reactions humans could have to mold. And like I said, this isn't all encompassing. There's tens of thousands of species of mold out there. There's probably things we may be experiencing that we don't even have names for in the medical literature. So this is just the very basics, starting with allergies, allergic sensitivity. If you're allergic to mold spores or specific types of mold or some mold proteins in general, you can have any number of allergic reactions. So think of dermal, you could have rashes, hives, you could have respiratory and sinus irritation, coughing, sneezing, runny nose, irritated eyes, respiratory distress, any sort of allergic reaction you could have to other allergens, you could presumably experience from mold. And that's probably the most common health effect, would be allergic sensitivities. Next being asthma. Mold can be a trigger in some individuals who have asthma to attacks or respiratory distress. There have been some studies to show that exposure to, and I want to say this carefully because it doesn't necessarily directly link mold to causing asthma, but the conditions that are conductive to mold growth, living in those types of conditions has been shown to have an increased risk of developing asthma. Hypersensitivity pneumonitis. This is generally an occupational type exposure, a very high, repeated high-level exposure. Now, it's not always the case, but initially it's described as occupational disease from repeated exposure. So people working in hay fields and other agricultural settings could just develop these complications. Infections are specifically a concern for immunocompromised individuals. So people who are on immunosuppressant drugs, chemotherapy, things like that, people who may have other health effects that create them to be immunocompromised. So there's some specific species of Aspergillus that can cause a disease called aspergillosis, where you're actually getting fungal colonies in your lung tissue of Aspergillus. There's fungal sinusitis, where you can have fungal growth inside of your sinus cavities, and some other fungal infections that are caused from molds, as opposed to things like yeasts or other more common fungal vectors. And then we'll get to the star of the show, mycotoxins. This is what you always hear about toxic mold and toxic black mold, and it's a touchy subject because it's an emotional subject for a lot of people. But generally speaking, in the scientific literature, we don't have a consensus on respirable exposure being enough to cause toxigenic effects in humans. What that means in plain terms, of the research that's been done, we haven't been able to say just breathing in mycotoxins gives you a high enough dose to cause the health effects that may be out of these toxins. Now, that's not to say that that is not truly the case. It's just saying that the studies that are available to this time haven't connected that. Now, where we do have a strong connection to mycotoxins is ingesting them orally. Um, so if you do eat something that has mycotoxins on it, you could have a high enough dose and you could have very serious health effects in those situations. Um, Generally speaking, a square inch of mold growth could have a few million spores on it. Um, and with the mycotoxins being a a metabolite that they produce and are present on the surface of them, you could ingest a high amount of mycotoxins. And then in a cubic meter of air, which is 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, in that big space of air, in a very heavily impacted environment, you may have a couple 100,000 spores per cubic meter in that much air. So you have a whole other order of magnitude of exposure when you ingest it. Got a great question here. Brett, I tested a home where they were replacing the AC unit. So there's been no cool, dry air for at least a week, but the Aspen came back much higher inside than outside. So is this more than likely growing inside or concentrate what has been outside? It has been raining in the days before. I'll say in my experience, Aspergillus penicillium is a type that I have seen indoors in environments that um, don't have any actual liquid water present, just the ambient humidity is high enough for a long amount of time. Vacation homes that are closed up, air conditioning turned off, no dehumidification going on, and then they come back and there's mold growing everywhere, but there's no leaks, but there's just been so much trapped humidity that it's creating enough moisture. Maybe there's some condensation happening occasionally. So it is possible that there's internal growth that's happening in such a small, like a micro reservoirs throughout the home that you don't visibly see giant colonies growing anywhere, but it's growing in carpets and fabrics and materials on walls and colonies that are not big enough to cause visual discoloration. That is possible. It has been raining in the days before, just meaning there's probably been some elevated humidity around that moisture. Typically speaking, it does take a little bit longer time than you may think. It might be that when they replaced the AC unit, there was mold or damaged materials around the AC unit that, in the act of removing it, it introduced those spores into the air indoors. And then there is, depending on the specific values, the numbers, it is possible that maybe the air indoor is just higher than the air outdoors at that exact moment, but it was higher the day before or earlier in the week that caused it just naturally. There's many different ways that could be a uh, interpreted depending on the values. Jim, are you talking of something like bread mold? Not always necessarily something as clear as moldy bread. Now that is a visualization that we all know and have experienced most likely, but there are other ways that you could get exposed to mold orally without eating visually moldy food. Touching and working with materials that are moldy, and then going to eat your food, you've got spores or potential things on your hands. There was one home that I was in that the woman was she made this tea where the base of the tea, the herbs and things that she used for the tea, you poured hot water over it every day. You didn't make a new tea bag. It was a tea that she'd make every day, and you would just add new things to that pile of herbs. And I suspected she had medical testing done that showed high levels of mycotoxins in her system, and I suspect that was potential source for the exposure with something like that. And then it could be truly just moldy food. Doesn't always have to be visually spoiled for there to be mold colonies that may be concerning. They are microscopic in nature, so they could be growing potentially in a way that's not immediately visible. So been asking and answering a lot of questions throughout this, so we're actually at time now, but if there's any other questions that come to mind immediately right now, I'll try to answer them now. Otherwise, uh, if there's more questions that we didn't get to, we'll answer them in a follow-up email for everyone to read. Maybe we'll post it in a blog for you. Or if you have any other questions that come up later, you can access us through our contact form on our website. You probably have Jim or my direct emails. If you don't have that already, just send a link through the website and we can get in touch in a direct way. But hope this was informative, and I hope you learned some things and got your questions answered. We've got another question here. Is air sampling always required? Typical find is mold in the attic. Air sample is not always required, and as an inspector, you'll want to use your judgment on when and where to sample. We've got great field guides that discuss situations. Air sampling in attics generally is an appropriate space because it's not a conditioned living space that you'd want to necessarily take an air sample from reliably. So there's a lot of different factors that come into play, and it's not always that you should be taking an air sample in every home. Is the goal of testing to have indoor air mold counts the same as the control air count? Not necessarily the same, but within an expected range of the outdoor air. The outdoor air counts can vary day to day, even throughout the day as the wind blows or weather changes. The outdoor counts is just truly a snapshot for that exact moment. And these levels are constantly going up and down, up and down. We're looking for these relative major differences between the outdoor and the indoor. So it's possible to have levels that are higher indoors than outdoors and it'd be acceptable. We're looking for things at much higher magnitudes or those types found indoors that are not often commonly found outdoors, like the chaetomiums, the stachybotrises, etc. How much assurance can I give a client that their home is mold free if just a few rooms are sampled? So a few things here. No home is truly mold free. We even in things like operating theaters, surgical centers, things like that, where they take very high levels of control to be as mold free as possible. There's still some potential that there's some mold in even those very clean environments. So it's never mold free. So that's an important distinction. How confident can you be if you're just testing a few rooms? It's one of these things where the budget and the results are directly linked, where if we could sample every room in the house, we'd be much more confident in the results than just sampling one room. But the budget doesn't always call for that availability. So it's always careful to say at the time where you tested, because you're only out for a moment in time. It's not, you can't say if it were raining and wind-driven rain, it would be the same. At that time, these are the levels that you're finding, and they're not indicating an issue. Now, that's only going to be relevant for the areas that we're talking about. All right, get one more question here. If you could answer if the reference site on the report is the same as the Pro Resources page. The link on our report is a different resources because that's meant for your client to click on. And then the Pro Resources page is more focused to you professionals. So they're two different resources pages. The sampling guides, the field guides, the videos are on the Pro Resources page. Is exterior air sampling okay to do when there's snow cover or temperatures are below freezing? We have a great blog on that. Check that out on our website. It'll get into details on inclement weather. Then the last one, do you recommend remediation for all levels? Example, a client receives your report and the attic or crawl has slight evidence. There should be remediation done anytime there's a material, and remediation is a general term of, doesn't necessarily always need to be a professional restoration contractor. Remediation meaning just removal of mold from the environment. If you have a surface sample that indicates that there's growth on a surface, yes, that surface should be remediated. The air sampling is a different story. You need to piece together you need to find the mold, the moisture, and additional context before deciding if remediation is appropriate. That's not something that us as a lab can really give you because it requires having that boots on the ground experience in that field. All right, I said last question, but I've got a follow-up. How much assurance can I give a client that their home is mold-free? I guess what I mean is, will the air circulate around equalizing mold counts? If you have central HVAC, generally speaking, the air is well mixed. And you want to devise a sampling plan where you're taking samples from the most representative areas you can with the number of samples you have. So it all depends on the specific home, and unfortunately, there's no one size fits all. So if a home doesn't have central air, it's generally not going to be as well mixed as one that does. If that air is not currently running, it's not as well mixed as it is currently running. So, a couple more questions. All right. Active mold, wet drywall versus inactive mold, dry drywall. How much will each react to testing procedures? Visible but inactive black mold. So even if the mold's not actively growing, it's dry, it's still going to come back positive on our results if that discoloration is mold. We're testing living, dead, active, inactive, viable, non-viable. Surface sampling is testing for anything on that surface that may be spores or fungal structures, growth structures, fruiting bodies, etc. So if it's dry, wet, living, dead, if you test it with a surface sample and it is mold on that surface, our report will catch it. All right, so that's all the time I've got. Like I said, any other questions, feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to answer them. And if you missed anything, you came in late, we're recording this, so you'll be able to catch it at a future time to catch what you miss or come back to some other topics. Thanks, everyone.